Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Breaking the Myths of ICS Defense, the Truth About Defending OT, ICS, Critical Infrastructure, sponsored by Arrow Electronics and OTORIO. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Dean Parsons, SANS Certified Instructor, Dave Cullen, OTORIO Field CTO, and Roland Ducote, Director, Sales Intelligence Solutions, OT, and Emerging Accounts at Arrow Electronics. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today. I know it's been a busy week for everybody, but we definitely want to get together and talk with you about some of the truths, some of the myths about ICS and OT, cybersecurity and defense. So we have a great lineup today. We have a number of panel questions that are selected from input from folks, and we also have some polls as well. We want to get your input on some of this stuff. So as Carol mentioned, my name is Dean Parsons, Certified SANS Instructor for ICS 515, and also the new 418, which I co-authored as well. So the 515 is a technical course for incident response for ICS, and the 418 class is a new 2-day class for the management of folks going to 410 and 515. So that's a little bit about me. Other than I have 20 years experience in cybersecurity and defense, the first 10 years of my career in IT, the last 10 to 11 specifically in ICS and power transmission, distribution, generation in cybersecurity and defense, building teams out, and also oil and gas, refineries, and also manufacturing, et cetera. So assessments in those areas as well continues to be my main focus beyond when I teach for SANS. But I'm going to turn it over to some of our other presenters and panelists today as well. So Roland, do you want to jump in and do an introduction?
Sure, Dean. Thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Roland Ducote, and I am a sales director for our Arrow Intelligence Systems group at Arrow Electronics. And part of what I do is really focus in on operational technology and emerging accounts. A little bit about myself: I've been with Arrow since 2000 and worked in a wide variety of different groups within Arrow, but primarily we've been focused on operational technology for a few decades. So whether that's in retail, industrial, or healthcare, we really focus in on the edge. So it's great to be here. Thanks, Dean.
Absolutely. Going to pass it over to Dave as well. Dave, welcome aboard.
Great. Thanks, Dean. And Jay sends his regrets. Unfortunately, we had travel issues. So I am here to fill in and hopefully we'll do an admirable job. Name is Dave Cullen. I'm from OTORIO. I'm the field CTO. I joined OTORIO earlier this year. And really our focus is risk management solutions for OT environments, helping industrial organizations manage their OT security risk. I joined OTORIO after about 10 years in the utility industry. Have a background in leading IT and OT cybersecurity, and definitely have experience when it comes to compliance and governance and policy setting. Have worked with government agencies and whatnot outside of the the daily responsibilities, but happy to be here and participate today.
Excellent. Sounds good. So it looks like there's great backgrounds all around here, which is going to help us contribute to the panel discussions, which are upcoming. But there's a reminder as well, any questions we don't get to, we will get to at a later time. So please put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to those at some point throughout. Okay, so here's the lineup for today. Since we have introductions completed at this point, yes, this still is a conversation we need to have. The differences between IT and ICS security. The differences are quite obvious when you look at the details. My concern is if we have folks that report to the board on ICS security, they're not looking at the details and how that risk can be represented first. So we will take a look at that differences aspect. We'll talk a little bit some of the threats today. So pipe dream, if you've heard of it before, will raise its head because it is an example of an ICS threat living off the land. Beyond that, we will touch on ransomware, but mostly specific threats to ICS where ransomware can also have an impact, not necessarily going to turn the lights out, right, as we know. And then we'll get heavy into the ICS security panel and discussions and some of those polls we talked about. So as we dive into this journey, the adventure here is really on critical infrastructure. So those of joining are probably from some sector that you see on the screen here. And if not, welcome aboard anyway. Our focus is really going to be on critical infrastructure, OT environments, ICS environments as well. So again, a note for the Q&A, drop your questions in as we go. Be awesome to get your feedback there. And also the polls are coming up shortly where we need your input. So the first thing we really want to talk about before we get to the panel is the IT and ICS not being the same. We know IT has been doing an amazing job for decades at doing things like moving and securing digital data. And that's awesome. Now, what in ICS we do is actually enable and secure physics, the things that interact with, sense, touch, change the real world. But that does not mean we can't utilize what works from IT in the ICS environment while having that nuanced discussion about, hey, that's not going to work, but this might work, but we have to change it before we put it in the ICS. So that's a conversation we see boards really trying to understand, and also the managers of ICS technical folks and security folks really trying to represent and support their team as they make these changes and deploy tools, technologies, people inside the ICS to do ICS specific security. So when we're talking about the differences between these, again, I want to focus on IT has been really doing amazing, focusing on the data at rest or data at transit for a long, long time. In the ICS, of course, we are focused on the engineering processes. And really, I'll show you later in a few moments of the Purdue model and which portion of that is really looked at as IT or common operating systems. So we'll get to that in a second. So the ICS focuses on engineering processes that monitor controlled real-time systems, physical inputs, sensing and changing the physical world. This means actually having some kind of physical output into the real world. So physics making and causing some kind of action in those critical infrastructure areas we talked about. So going a little deeper here, what's the real difference when you talk about roles, tasks, people on the plant floor? And now we're really talking about these main differences, which we'll touch on over the next few slides in depth. So safety is number one. We see the safety culture being the prominent thing that drives ICS. ICS is the business, let's face it. If ICS is down, that there's no revenue for the company. If IT is down, that's not a good day either, but there's different impacts with different missions. So safety is number one in ICS. So what we can see folks do in ICS as new managers in ICS security is leverage the physical safety culture there to make sure you align with that. So security in ICS supports safety. System designs as well, we'll see in a moment that there's engineering devices, of course, that you cannot install endpoint security solutions on and so on and so forth. So the system designs, architecture, aligning to the Purdue model and other kinds of architectural, I guess, best practices for ICS are obviously somewhat different as well, which can be different per site that you have. The support for those, of course, the engineering folks who are programming the PLCs and the field RTUs, all of those things, or even the engineering folks we may have to rely on to help with incident response, getting events from the field devices, all that support during incident response is also a significant difference between IT and ICS. The controls as well. We probably already have stories that we've seen IT come in and deploy things like IT security solutions on endpoints, which only do some coverage, but may actually cause problems as well. So the cybersecurity controls are different. We have a slide coming up comparing some of those in just a moment. The biggest thing, which is my main focus when I teach and do assessments, is incident response, where we're all used to the traditional 5 or 6 steps of incident response. Usually there's like 7 or 8, and they're very different inside the ICS. I mean, the methodology is similar, but the tools, the approach are different, and the data you're looking for are different as well, which means we have different tools to support that. So these are the main differences between them. And I know someone is gracefully going to say, well, what about IT and OT convergence? Love it. We have converged the actual technologies about 20 years ago in ICS. So we've been using off-the-shelf commodity-based common operating systems for a long time for SCADA control environments, et cetera. And that's not going to go away anytime soon. And that's a benefit. We do see that as a benefit. So the conversation in convergence I see today is not really about technology. It's more so about the people, the teams. How do we get IT and ICS and engineering to talk together on a common ground to protect the ICS, which has more than just these common operating systems. So this is where I see the conversation being today, because again, technology, we've converged on the protocols and some of the operating systems 20 years ago. But we are still looking at a ton of engineering devices that I would wager are absolutely OT and ICS. So as you see on screen here, we do see a general representation of the Purdue, kind of loosely aligned, where we have traditional technologies that you might see at the top. So if you roll up to a processing plant or a wastewater management facility, or even a power grid, and you walk into the control center, you're going to see some Windows applications. And you're thinking, well, this is all Windows. Be careful with that. Everything below those Windows devices, probably something very, very different. But the head of those environments are probably running Windows to some degree. So the traditional operating systems at the top of the Purdue, so obviously in the enterprise and possibly in the DMZ, and maybe even down to level 3, 3.5, you're going to see supervisory control elements running Windows. But they're all contributing to everything below that, which is the control elements, programmable logic controllers, safety instrumented system, embedded HMIs, all of those devices, which you will never see or be able to manage in an IT environment. Below that, of course, we do see more adapted operating systems, embedded operating systems, as we mentioned, industrial protocols specifically, some proprietary, of course, interacting with serial devices, sensors and actuators in the field. And this, of course, is the manipulation and changing of the physical world. But I would wager everything you see on screen here, even the top level of the Purdue, where it's traditional technology, I still would suggest it is all OT or ICS. It should be treated as such. As we pivot through this to say, well, if there is a traditional operating system here, what controls can we copy and paste from IT into OT? And there are some you can, but I want to just point out this next slide, because we're just going to point out a few controls that are very suitable for IT, not so suitable for the ICS environments. So the ones that we know have been working for decades in IT: antivirus, firewalls, vulnerability scanning, and the methodologies behind them, regularly automated and also possibly interactive scanning, if you will, or aggressive scanning. Security awareness, event detection, incident response on an actual incident is treated differently as well, patching, and also intrusion detection systems versus intrusion prevention. So I want to break down a couple of these in a bit more detail. And the first one I love to pick on is really the vulnerability scanning, where in IT makes sense. We do external in, we do internal scans on a regular basis, and somebody in IT security gets a report every 4 weeks that says, hey, here's the updated vulnerability map for your environment. Here's the delta, here's where we patched, and so on. Love the methodology. It has been working well for like a well-oiled machine for decades, as we've talked about. But in the ICS, it is less of a cycle, so it's not 30 days, and the methodology is likely not active, which means it's not interrogating devices and putting packets on the networks. It's more so doing it in a passive way, which can be very beneficial as well, prioritizing one of those main differences we talked about, which is safety. So it's more so tested in ICS first, run during maintenance windows possibly, and there's passive options there. So a clear divide on using that control for vulnerability scanning. I want to jump to an incident in IT versus ICS as well. So typically in IT, there's a system that's compromised. If there is a compromise, it's then taken off the wired and wireless network, of course, quickly as possible. Someone is in an office environment has the ability to do that. And that's fantastic. Sometimes there's memory acquisition, some forensics analysis, depending on the environment you're in and your regulations and so on. But generally, there is a process of take it off the wire, contain it, patch it, redeploy it once it's patched and fully up to date and not a threat to the network anymore. And that makes a lot of sense. So typically an incident response in IT could last a fairly short period of time, whereas in ICS, it's mostly contained. And if you can run the ICS operations with a contained threat, I'll be very clear here, contained threat, then you can possibly then remove that threat entirely, full eradication on the next maintenance window that engineering has scheduled. And what this does is two things. If there is some contaminant which really doesn't have an impact to the ICS control elements and the engineering, then why not wait once it's in a contained state to fully do eradication? So we see an incident in IT happen fairly rapidly and response rapidly. In ICS, the difference is maintain safety. If you have a threat which doesn't have an impact, you're maintaining safety versus take everything down, impacting safety, impacting production, et cetera. So there's a different mission and approach there. And of course, the last two I want to jump in is patching, which has been like clockwork in IT every 30 days, maybe on a Tuesday every month, possibly, for those common Microsoft operating systems. And in ICS, you could probably do more patching on the ICS environment for Windows devices, not saying every 30 days, but in the upper levels of the Purdue, patching is more frequent. When you get below those environments and you go into the engineering devices, of course, then patching becomes more of a calculated approach. When can you do it? When's there a maintenance window, et cetera? Because we don't want to take systems down, impacting safety, when we can patch on the next maintenance cycle. And just a reminder here, I'm not saying don't patch. I'm saying there's a different risk profile. There's a risk with regards to getting on IT, and it's not the same vectors or impacts if an adversary does make it to the ICS. So different approach for patching as well. The last thing I want to talk about before shifting to a couple other items is the network intrusion detection versus intrusion prevention, where in ICS, we prioritize detection of packets on the network that are possibly malicious. And in IT, we accept the fact that if we drop packets in a false positive condition, then it's not necessarily going to be a bad day. But if we drop packets from a safety engineering and device, from an HMI to a sys to some other controller, for example, to shut a plant down, and we trip the plant off by dropping packets that are legitimate, having false positives, then that's not so much accepted in the ICS. So in IT, intrusion prevention system, rock on. In ICS, still today, we are preferring network intrusion detection system only, where it does not actually inject or drop packets on the wire. So before we get into the next few slides and poll, I want to just raise the question here, where does ICS security best fit? We have seen security report to different areas here, IT and ICS. So for example, the CISO, OT security, we have seen reporting there. And throughout some of these, you might think, well, I've seen that before, or you might think that that's really beneficial, or there's a conflict of interest there. So all of these things are coming up that we're seeing when we do assessments. And we've even seen OT security reporting to the CIO for the IT side. But again, the plant is on the ICS side. We've also seen the CIO reporting directly to finance. So there's a lot of different areas where security can report to that we've seen over the last number of years. What we're seeing more of is things like VP of engineering taking an understanding and managing that risk of security for their plant. We also see the operating officer as well take ICS security under their wing as well. So I'm not suggesting either one of these is right or wrong, but I do want to raise the question based on the reporting structure that you may see, and you're going to get an opportunity in a second to put your poll in here, is if there is an event happening on the IT side, such as an email compromised, and at the same time, there's a human machine interface or HMI that operates a power plant or refinery that happens at the same time, so incident in both environments, which incident specifically gets the prioritization of safety and security and the resources and the effort to investigate and do containment, eradication, and so on, recovery. So that's the question I do want to raise here. And again, this is a trend we're seeing, that there's possibly some shifts of where ICS security reports to in the last couple of years, and possibly moving forward, possibly a change in that reporting structure as well. So from a threat intelligence perspective, shifting completely from the reporting structure, I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in threats in ICS today. Now, there's no question that what we're seeing is the commonalities of initial intrusions coming in through possibly an IT. So threat intelligence supports the idea of ICS attacks, commonly first starting in the IT environment. And you've guessed it, of course, through phishing scams and so on and so forth. That does not mean that the adversary only uses that technique to try to compromise an ICS. In a lot of cases, we've seen the adversary try to get into IT and then quickly change their tactic, techniques, and procedures and tool sets to target the ICS with ICS specific targeting, either commodity or custom built kits as well. The ICS attacks we have seen in the past, which we do not think will change in the future, we'll see more of this likely, is more of the not just malware being seen to cause impact, which means we're likely to see more living off the land, the abuse of the human-machine interface against the system itself. So the adversary pretending to be an operator, but just using the system in a malicious way, as an example. And of course, the abuse of native protocols already in the environment for legitimate purposes. So common protocols such as OPC, which is found in several ICS environments, of course, DMP3 in the electric sector, Modbus TCP in several sectors as well, even IEC 104, which we have seen being abused with crash override in the electric sector, Profinet, and so on. There's a bunch more. So we do see this trend continuing, at least looking at the threat intelligence, that IT really needs to have awareness of a possible stage 1 attack, we call it, where an adversary possibly tries to get access to IT and then pivot from IT then to the ICS. So I can break down these trends to say, here's really what we're seeing and how it escalates through to an actual impact in the control environment. Foothold in IT, ransomware even on IT as well, could also impact ICS operations. So take as an example, if you have a MES system, ERP system on IT that your control system relies on for billing, shipping, understanding what products you have to, or recipes required, and the types of substances you have to produce some of your products, for example. If that's on IT and ransomware is on IT, then there's an impact potentially to ICS. Beyond that, we have seen adversaries pivot towards stealing credentials from IT to try to also pivot over digitally into the ICS. So from a technical perspective, the advice here, based on what we've seen, is if you have an active directory infrastructure on IT and it's a shared infrastructure with ICS, they really should be separated out and not trusted. Even trusted forests are not something that we recommend. Beyond that, again, it's living off the land. Adversary remotely accessing HMIs from insecure remote access, an example, which we've seen earlier last year with the Oldsmar event, someone getting on a wastewater management facility, changing the chemical mix of the wastewater management facility. And of course, then native protocol abuse. That's the last kind of element in this trend that we're seeing that has the most impact from what we're seeing. And that would be something like Pipe Dream, which was recently discovered a couple months ago, which again abuses engineering software against itself. Now you're thinking, what of these security controls we talked about will discover that kind of abuse? This is where we talk about active cyber defense. So today, if you were to look at your ICS or OT security program, looking at the people that are using the tools, looking at the tools that may be there as well, where would you fit on the slotting scale? Do you have architecture in place? What about passive defense, firewalls, patching, things of those nature? But of course, to detect what we just discovered in those trends, we really need to focus on the active defense part of things. And this is where we're not only using the tools from vendors that are out there, specifically in the ICS space and OT, it's having the folks trained to know what the ICS looks like naturally, those control protocols, et cetera, and then spotting the outliers between them. And that is how we can discover and detect and then defend against these kinds of attacks of native abuse control system environments. And just briefly, before we jump into that panel discussion, and I'm reminded if you have questions, drop them into the Q&A, this is the cycle that we're talking about. And selfishly, I will say that I teach this in ICS 515 for two reasons. One, it's super fun. Two, it's actually practical. And this is really where we see any critical infrastructure or ICS or OT environment should be today as a best practice, where you're doing this cycle on a regular basis, driven by human defenders. They're ingesting threat intelligence specifically for your sector. You're looking at the network, getting visibility on the control network. So at the lower level of the Purdue, right? So anything from 3.5 and below, right down to see sensor communication back and forth if possible. And then doing threat detection with the threat intelligence and visibility. And when you look, you're going to find something. So then it's incident response and then threat and environment manipulation as part of that cycle. So that's generally what we're doing today, and really we see as the best practice for ICS organizations and critical infrastructure today. So that's what I really wanted to kind of start off with today, but I want to pass this off now, open up the discussion with Roland and David, and really talk about some of the polls we have and some of the main questions that we've been getting as well. So this is where I'm going to say this is where we drink additional coffee here and jump right into the first poll. So folks that are out there online, again, thanks for joining. Here's the first poll that we're going to launch. So where does your ICS or OT responsibility report to today? So on Zoom right now, you should see a poll that's being launched at this time. you'll have the ability then to look at that poll, read the question, and then select your answer of where you report to today. This is anonymous, so feel free to take a look there. And already we're seeing a lot of folks taking a look and answering the questions here. So I'll leave it up for another bit yet, just so we can get some folks in here. And then David and Roland will have a discussion on what the results will be to understand what trends we've seen, where do you think this is going in the future, and kind of go from there. So I'll leave it up for another 10 seconds there, and then we will take a look at the polls. And I'm already seeing the data so far, and it's very interesting seeing this. It's looking at the same poll 2 years ago, drastically different here. So another 5 seconds. All right, good stuff. So I'll end the poll, and hopefully we can display this and have a discussion on this poll. All right, so let's share the results out. So again, the question is, where does your ICS OT responsibility report to today? And the options here are IT security, CIO, CSO, COO, VP of engineering, ICS security leader, which could be a supervisor, or other. If you have other, please feel to put that into the questions or chat window, wherever works for you. So David, Roland, do you see this being shared out as well? Can you see the results on your screen, guys?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor. I mean, what's your thoughts, your first reaction to where security is reporting to for ICS today, that function? What's your thoughts?
So pretty common in terms of what we see today. I think IT security was number 2 there. I was a little surprised on the VP of engineering, but I think now some of the newer activities that we've started working on, it's either in engineering or operations that's being given that responsibility.
Okay,
but
so in
IT
your
security
travels,
wasn't a surprise.
Right, understood, and that makes sense. I think what we're seeing is a shift from more so from IT security to maybe a CISO or CISO or a VP of engineering. But I'm also curious, but also not surprised in the VP of engineering, because we've seen more of that shift. It's in the plant, so own that risk, which is good. And we see again, security, IT security is probably the first tier, VP of engineering number 2. Below that is ICS security leader specifically. So interesting changes. David, any thoughts on this? What have you seen with your customers, your experience in the field?
Well, I think this aligns with what we're seeing, and you said it. I mean, I think what we are starting to see is perhaps the early onset of the shift to more C-level oversight. I think, ICS security definitely, is gaining higher profile within organizations, and organizations are realizing that they need to take this. Take the risk, take the decision making up a chain, I guess you could say, and really look at C-level oversight for this. We often ask our customers at the end of the day, who owns OT risk? And that is often a surprisingly difficult question to answer. And so often they'll say, well, VP engineering must be that person, right? But really, I think there's a growing awareness, and IT security, certainly, it's a high percentage, but oftentimes that's the last resort, to say it that way, is that, well, they have best practice, and they need, they're the best situated to apply some form of security to these environments. So as organizations mature, I think you start to see these kind of percentages shift into a positive way.
Absolutely, I would agree as well. And I think just you pointed out really well and elegantly, Dave, that IT security has been doing security forever, and what they're, I think, doing now is they're sharing what they have done in the past for IT and saying, like, ICS folks, like, will this work? Will this work? And we're seeing that kind of like, well, we can help, maybe 10% here, but really the engineering stuff is all engineering. So how do we get there? And this, I think, is where the board is asking, wait a second, you mean we can operate the power grid and we rely on operating the power grid on not using Windows and like the engineering devices? And then the questions are, who owns security and how do we make sure there's a focus on that? The other side is that if IT security continues to, I'll say, try to manage the OT and ICS security risks, then I expect their teams to get a lot larger with a whole lot more different kinds of I'll say, engineering type of training as well. So if IT security does take it on, I mean, I don't know if they can because of resourcing challenges we know exist everywhere. So yeah, sure. Good points on this. Anything else in this one, David or Roland?
Real quick question. So you had mentioned kind of the change over time if we would have done this poll 2, 3, 4 years ago. What have you seen in terms of that change over time versus what we're seeing this morning?
Absolutely. So I would say that VP of engineering would be extremely low, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5%, whereas today we're seeing 21%. So to Dave's point, we are seeing that shift. It's happening where boards are asking the questions, and I would say appointing or standing up ICS security folks wherever they kind of would report to. So when I do assessments and plans, that as an example, I do see I'm meeting more with engineering folks than IT. IT is still at the table. They have to be. Stage 1 happens possibly in the IT environment. So that's definitely part of it. So by no means am I saying the poll results here or before or splitting the teams. We have to make sure we continue to talk here because that's how we check the adversary across stage 1 and stage 2. Yeah, good point. Does that answer your question, Roland?
It did. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Good stuff. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll pivot on to the next element, which is actually a question. And so what we have here is, I think I can stop sharing the poll and come back to the poll. Yeah, all right, here we go. So what I can do is I can come back to the poll in a second and really look at question number 1 here, which is, what are the types of impactful ICS attacks that would actually shut down an ICS operation? And I think this is really birthed out of people asking questions of, if there's ransomware there, does that mean we have to shut down refinery? Like, is that what we're seeing today? So I'll open it up to yourself, Roland and David, on what's your thoughts on this one.
Dave, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. I think, to extend it out, just what you're just saying, Dean, really, it speaks to all of these other disciplines that are perhaps brought into focus during an attack, after an attack, et cetera, right? So many attacks can be extremely impactful because of the uncertainty of the response, right? So when all of these scenarios haven't necessarily been planned out, practiced, and brought into kind of, whether it's runbooks or what have you for response activity, then even, dare I say it, a ransomware attack or something that could very well be benign and not a threat to the ICS environment becomes a threat, because we're uncertain how to respond. We're uncertain how to segregate and really separate the environments. I mean, the old air gap mentality is certainly not the new mentality. So it really comes down to being able to align the priorities, the best practice, and then having defined processes to give that confidence, because oftentimes the tools are there. It's more, how do you operate the tools? You have safety systems, you have resiliency built in, but how do you keep the knowledge fresh so you have confidence in a response activity?
Right. Love that you brought up, I guess, architecture as well. So, air gap versus today connectivity. Connectivity and convergence of technology doesn't mean you have to join the networks like at the hip without controls in place, right? So a lot of times when doing assessments, we have $1 million and help us spend that. I'm like, that's awesome. Let's look at your network architecture first. Oh yeah, by the way, we can do this with $100,000 or less, or probably with all the equipment you already have in place. Change your architecture, put in actual useful ACLs, protocol analysis for ICS specifically, and then we can spend that $1 million and then have that $1 million be much more of a high return of investment than prior to doing architecture first. So yeah, air gap, there was a time, right? But we're not there today, but architecture critical for sure. Roland, what's your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think when I first saw this question, where my mind went was, so where you've got an ICS system, there's that more than likely that that manufacturing area is inside of a building. And when you look at protocols like BACnet, there are vulnerabilities. And so as you're trying to connect your building, or if you're trying to get more data, you're linking into control systems for the asset itself. So maybe what we've seen are the ability to take control where devices have been brought onto a network, there hasn't been visibility created to understand what's actually inside the building. And so if you're controlling HVAC systems, you shut that down. You have to run people out because of temperature and or air quality. It's an interesting way to shut down ICS systems while actually attacking a larger asset. But that's where my mind went in terms of some of the challenges we've seen over the past few weeks.
And you mentioned visibility, which we have to tie back into the active cyber defense cycle of if we don't have an understanding to do detection on the network. And I keep bringing up the network here because if you have internet devices, you can't put AV on them, kind of thing. So the network is really a main focus of ICS defense today, building on architecture, which was Dave's point as well. So yeah, fantastic. All right, let's pivot. Yeah,
real quick, just another point on that, and that's where we've seen again, taking a step back from our perspective. When organizations are coming to us, they're interested in some of these different smart technologies or the ability to get into control systems to pull data off or do things that are effective to the business. Where we start is really what you were talking about in your slides are great around visibility, making sure that you start with good hygiene and you understand architecture and you've got a visibility into what is on your system today before you start doing really anything to get things connected.
Right. Okay, let's continue on because I do have a feeling if we don't, we could probably continue to get value just out of this one question. This is great. Enough. This is really good. No, this is fantastic though. Your input is fantastic here, guys. Question 2, and I'll pass this to Roland because he's right hot on this as well, is how does somebody affordably start maturing their ICS security program, start maturing the program today? Like, what would be your advice based on what you've seen interacting with your customers and your thoughts following the trends today? Where would they start affordably doing this?
I think it's probably start taking your classes. I think is that.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. No, it's it's all good. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways. I mean, from what we've seen is working with organizations that align with your existing maturity level. So you talked about tools and training, and I think that's a good place to start, where you're focused in on getting the visibility that you need today with the resources that match. Certainly you can go pretty deep into this space if you're looking to mature the ICS security program. But working with partners like OTORIO, working with other organizations that provide different levels of value and really understanding the different tools that you can bring into your tool bag is the right place to start. Before you start actually starting cutting POs for those different tools, make sure that you're trained and you've got a vision as to how you want to protect your ICS network.
I totally align with your prioritization of people and then tools. I mean, none of us want to have situations where someone is spending a ton of money, you put in the network, and then the board is like, check, we have security in place for the ICS. And little do they know, there's no one to manage that. It's not a set and forget. So I love and I do agree with your prioritization of the training and then the tools to use that effectively. I think one other thing I pointed out, which you triggered me on before I pass it to David, is maturing the ICS security program. If we do have, looking at the poll, folks in IT security that are taking on responsibility or shifting responsibility and their role into ICS security, I think to mature their role or understanding of ICS, I really have seen it work where they're actually sitting with and working with engineers. I'm talking job shadowing. So they're sitting with engineers for not 1 or 2 days, but it's like, you're over here with Sally and Bob, and you're with them for 2 months in the ICS. And I think that opens their eyes significantly, and I think that's a good place to start maturing as well. But David, what's your thoughts on this one as well? Anything else to add above and beyond?
I think it's important to reinforce and kind of continue to beat that drum of knowledge really is key here. Arming your teams with knowledge, knowing that you have cultural differences within the teams. There's a lot of best practice that can be shared internally even, which is a very easy way to start. Roundtable it inside the organization. Don't set up these situations where, well, this is my requirement, but this is my requirement, right? And these adversarial situations. Collaborate on knowledge. I think training is crucial. And then also looking at what you can adopt in terms of best practice from compliance frameworks, right? So I'm not one who preaches compliance for the sake of compliance or checking boxes, but they often offer a solid foundation to start building upon, and offering a certain level of prescription for where to start, especially. And I think this is another great way that IT and OT can align and collaborate, because oftentimes, IT security might be further down the road, or just more mature when it comes to, say, risk assessment methodologies or what have you.
Right.
So, I think there's a lot of great knowledge that can be shared. And I mean, from a very practical, hands-on, what can you do type of thing from your tool set is gaining visibility and context. I think we've already said it, but the more you know, the better you're better situated to defend. And it's not just asset visibility, it's an awareness of how things work together, how the environment behaves, what's the baseline of the environment, and then being able to build your knowledge on top of that, and your expertise and your threat intelligence and all of those things, right?
I think you really mentioned earlier about having, the teams kind of work together. And then I think you mentioned putting that on the table and kind of having discussions. And I think from what I've found during assessments, it's to do that. It's not actually a technical approach to mature the program. It's actually it's a round table, but it's maybe even a tabletop. It's here's what could happen in the ICS. Who do we need to bring in? And then all of a sudden, security from IT is there, security from ICS is there, safety team is there, engineer is there, VP of engineering, all of that can help. So I think it's like a soft skill thing. It's how do you start maturing, possibly starting not at the packet level, but with the relationships and building it up to say, IT, we've been looking at the threat intelligence and we see adversaries come into IT first. So how do we make sure you guys can handle that? Let us know if it's coming, and then we can kind of work with that for the second half of the attack towards ICS. Yeah, great points in that as well, Dave. Okay, so anything further, Roland, or should I switch into the next poll we have here for the audience?
Go for it.
All right, awesome. Audience still with us, which is cool, and lots of incoming feedback, which is great. We now want to get your feedback on this next poll question, and it really is, what is the main risk you and your board are concerned about today? So not just yourself from threat intelligence, but interacting with your board, your managers, your superiors, part of your team. What are you most concerned about? Your options are ransomware, ICS specific attacks that can cause safety concerns, specifically attacks that can cause production loss or complete halt operations, risks that introduce remote access or third-party vendor risk, supply chain, and other as well. So I'll release the poll here. So I'll launch that. You should be able to see that poll now. So please take a look at the poll. Let us know your thoughts on this, and I'll leave it up there for a while. And already we're seeing folks interact with the poll. Yeah, very interesting so far, actually. Oh, but it's changing. We have to give it more time. We have to give it more time here. Dave, Roland, I'm really looking forward to your interaction on this as well, because you're coming at this from a different perspective as well. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your comments on this one as well, based on how you've interacted with your customers and what you've seen. So looking here, I'll leave it open for another, say, 10 seconds, 10 or 15 seconds, just so people have the opportunity to contribute there. And then we'll do some analysis here. All right, looks like the polling has quieted down a bit. All right, so let's end the poll and share out the results. So here we go. So you should be able to see the results now on screen. And yeah, so ransomware is high up there, probably number 2. And I think that one of the main risks you and your board are concerned about is really the specific attacks that can cause production, halting operations, which can directly impact safety in a way, but also impact, obviously, financials. ICS is the business here. So interesting here, we see as well, third party coming up close behind that as number 3. And then, of course, focusing on specifically the safety aspect close behind that as well. So I'll pass it over to Roland. What's your thoughts on the poll thus far?
So I'll answer the question, but I think maybe tee up Dave as well. So OTORIO put out a report in January of 2022 around cybersecurity findings. And the one thing that I think is really interesting here is that the risk of supply chain compromise is so low. And Dave can speak to that more, but OT has such a long tail of supply chain, and we've seen it happen before, where they're maybe more in the retail environment, but it's similar, where they're able to get into an organization's network through a third party. And in the report, not to take too much of Dave's thunder, but 99% of the surveys reported a supply chain attack in the last 12 months. And so, I think this data is absolutely fantastic, but really, like I said, surprised that the risk of supply chain compromise being so small.
Okay, very cool. And I'm not sure if you're able to share that out in the comments, that report you mentioned. Feel free to do so. Dave, go ahead. Bring the thunder.
Yes, yeah, certainly that was our CISO survey report that we launched earlier this year. And the interesting bit, and just a little nuance here, is unlike this poll, we allowed people to select multiple options, right? So what we really saw was this high percentage on these key themes, which are acknowledged here, right? So yes, these are all high numbers, but what we saw was people were selecting ransomware and ICS specific attacks that can cause production to completely halt. There's a much more awareness, again, at the C level, that there's many concerns, but the awareness is greater as to what the attack vectors are and what they need to be focusing on. Doesn't mean that all the answers are there yet, but I think that's an important nuance to acknowledge, because it's driving a lot of awareness. It's driving a lot of downward motion in the organizations. Well, we got to look at this. We got to take care of this. But it's also driving investment. So in that survey, we also asked, what's your projected spend? Is it going to go down? Is it going to stay the same? Is it going to go up? And it was 90 some odd percent with heavy increase, significant increase of maybe 50% in ICS security budget. And I think when we see these factors driving action, we can be encouraged, not just because as vendors, it's, so much. We've seen the fragility of supply chain if something is impacted, and, so much depends on these critical environments staying safe and operational. So I think the awareness is important to acknowledge.
If we take a look at the next question, we'll pivot into some recommendations that may focus on those areas that we're finding now as possible gaps in the environment. So let's pivot from the poll, but really kind of keep the idea and thought in our head of where do we go next? So question number 3 really brings up, what would be the main recommendations? What should organizations be focusing on for ICS cyber defense, given what we've seen in 2022? And I can't not bring up pipe dream and scalable kind of frameworks and abuse of protocols in the network. So I'll pass this to you, Dave. So what's your thoughts and recommendations on focusing on ICS defense efforts? Where would you go in 2022 and beyond, based on what you've been seeing with your customer interactions?
I think back to the point I think you made earlier during your presentation, Dean, really, where visibility is much deeper than just knowing what assets you have, right? And the basic details of those assets. It is really about the context, everything that's around the devices, how they interact, how they behave. I think I'm repeating myself, but to have those tenets of active defense, visibility is a much deeper term at that point, right? So it comes down to architecture, passive defense, threat intelligence, and then the capabilities that all extend from that. And I think closely coupled with that, the opportunity there is that you can start to apply kind of a risk-based approach to taking action based on what you see. If there's a threat in the environment, yes, you respond. You follow the mechanisms that you laid out quite clearly and quite well. But beyond that, you have an opportunity with this deeper visibility to take a risk-based approach and look at what can I tangibly do to reduce my risk and to reduce my exposure and improve these elements that you've kind of packaged as active defense, right?
I love that you brought up, understanding the assets, what they are, where they are, the critical crown jewels, which we've talked about several times in these conversations and prior. But you're right. If we were to take the top 5 to 6 critical assets for the ICS and make sure we get at least visibility for those as a start, that's a good recommendation for 2022, 23, and whatever your budget can help with, or your focus can help with, right? With the team you already have. So I think, again, just to reiterate, I think a recommendation would be get visibility around the top 5 to 6 assets, which doesn't have to be a heavy lift, right? It's understanding what your HMI does. What protocols does it use? Who hits it remotely, right? Oh, is there somebody hitting your PLCs to reprogram that at the plant level? Then is that normal, right? Can you just flip the switch on the physical switch on the key on the PLC to say, you know what, no one does remote updates to the PLC. They have to be on the plant floor, a way to reduce risk. Roland, any thoughts on any of those points, but your own as well?
Yeah, so I think we talked a lot about tools, training, and resources, and that's where I would go in terms of an area for focus. I think it does build on what Dave was talking about in terms of visibility, where making sure that your resources are well trained, that you fill those skill gaps. So yeah, for some folks on the call, Profibus, Modbus, those may be new terms, or for that, those are certainly new terms for IT. So making sure that those individuals are trained, or you have the right resources to help support that activity around visibility.
Excellent, love it, love it. Let's do question number 4. Looking at the time as well, we're pretty good, but I don't want to take anybody else's time. But let's jump into question number 4, which is, how does the adversary get in there? What are the most common vectors you see of the attacks in the ICS today? What are you guys seeing as the adversary getting into the control environment? How do they get there?
I'd offer up, Dave, if you want to answer this one first. You probably see more than we do.
Well, I mean, we still have, it's way too prevalent where an IT-borne attack really has the ability to migrate, right? And it seems trivial to almost say it, but we're still dealing with this, right? We still need to create better awareness of the connectivity and the relationship between IT and OT. So that's still the most common vector we see. Now, I think you bring not to get into geopolitical issues or anything like that, but I think we're starting to see the pointers now. Luckily, some a lot has been brought into public knowledge, and pipe dreams, things like that, where you see the pointers to, we need to be ready for more sophisticated ICS-borne attacks, and dare I say, that's a little scary, because that requires different tooling, different capability that most organizations have today, right? So, I think again, the continued awareness will help mitigate that, but we're hearing that discussion more often than we ever have before.
I think you raise a good point there, and I'll add by saying it's, because you mentioned geopolitical tensions and geopolitical motivations with probably state-sponsored attackers. It's not above the adversary to target somebody who is working with your organization, external client, vendor, et cetera, and target them as a way in, as a vector to get in, because let's face it, when you're interacting with a partner, there's more trust there. So it's not above the adversary to target that, even through transient device or some other mechanism, through trusted email, whitelisted email from that partner as well, which would bring us to an IT to ICS compromise. So yeah, I think there's a lot that can be said from the threat intelligence we've seen the last few years on the vectors we've seen. And if you look at MITRE ATT&CK framework, for example, and things of the ICS version of the threats we've seen, it's IT, it's transient device, but it's engineering workstation related. And even, dare I say, today in 2022, it's remote access compromise, insecure remote access compromise. Yeah. Roland, what can you add to this one? I know that a lot of folks
not
probably...
much. From an IT perspective, I think the other thing you had talked about already, the number 2 for me would be supply chain.
Yeah, nice.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, vendor.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, so the last question coming up in a second, and the last poll before we finish out today. So the last question is, and so happy we got this question, is it's really, is there a specific ICS incident response tabletop scenario you'd recommend we conduct this year, and this person comes from oil and gas. And I would say this probably can extend to any sector, but Roland, have at it. What's your thoughts on a recommended ICS response tabletop?
For oil and gas, I definitely have to pass it to Dave. That's from a sorry, go ahead, Dave, please.
Oh, no, it's okay. I think back to the concept of knowing the critical environment and how to, as a tabletop, how do we isolate that? How do we island the refinery, right, away from all other networks? Yes, we might have to turn some things manual. We might have to take certain specific actions to keep safety in check. But all those sorts of things should be practiced so you can really identify how do we maintain this ability to quickly island the key operation and know that we have the confidence that we still have some form of visibility. We still have some form of really forensic capability to still engage in IR. And it seems like it should be trivial and common sense and planned, but this with dynamic threat landscape and the rate of change in environments today, this needs to be, I think, it's a tabletop scenario that should be practiced frequently.
I would agree. I think going even deeper than that, I would suggest probably two. And the reason I'm suggesting these two is because of threat intelligence. These are the main two I've been really focusing on, depending on the sector, but this works in oil and gas, electric, wastewater management, manufacturing, chemical. And my suggestion is to do two, not back to back, have a month or so between, but it's to do two tabletops with everybody on deck: IT security, ICS security, engineers, operators, VPs, etc. And the first scenario is ransomware happens on IT. How does that impact the ICS? Right? What are you then relying on IT? To your point about island, can you run in operations without IT or internet connectivity? And how long can you do that? And that might mean you have vendors physically going to site to help support you in general situations, regular maintenance, et cetera, rather than VPNing in or remote accessing in. So the first one would be ransomware and IT as a scenario. And the next one would be, again, can't not bring this up. If you see an adversary in your network that is abusing the protocols you use daily for operations and engineering, how do you detect that? And I think it goes back to it'll point out and reveal if and where you do or do not have network visibility in the ICS. Can you go in and say, I want to see all the packets that are on the network for OPC or all the BACnet protocol packets? I want to see that. And if you have those gaps, you're easily going to find that in a tabletop without even touching the plant floor, really, if you have the right people at the plant at the tabletop. I think those are my main two. Roland, anything else before the last poll?
I think I'll just stay in my box and say supply chain. If you're going to tabletop scenario, that's where I think looking at different vendors and how that could be a potential threat vector. So
yeah, excellent. No, absolutely. A third one for sure. Supply chain. It's real and it happens and it happened. So absolutely, great point, man. All right, the last poll for today before we hand it back off to closing comments is this, and so I'll open it up as well. This is the last poll. Poll number 3. Question is, what is your ICS security priority for 2022 into next year, 2023? Is it visibility? Is it hiring someone on your team specifically for ICS? Training someone on your team for ICS? Is it endpoint protection for the traditional operating systems at the upper level of the Purdue, Windows, Linux devices, etc.? What about encryption on the ICS? What about reducing the risk of transient devices in the ICS facilities? So the poll is launched. We're getting some folks interacting with the poll now, but we'll leave it open for another 15, 20 seconds before we wrap up discussion on this point, and then have some closing comments. And yeah, some folks are still presenting there or inputting their thoughts there. So I'll give it another, say, 10 seconds or so. Good stuff. I definitely want to get your guys' feedback on this. Again, going back to your experience dealing with customers and the services you provide as well. Where does this fit in? All right, and 5 seconds left there. All right. So let's end the poll and share the results out. Okay, so share the results out here. So this is what we're seeing. Hopefully you guys can see this here. And this is Interesting. So the first one for sure by a long shot is ICS network visibility. We are getting the message out there. People are understanding what's needed and they're going for it, which is really good. This is only going to protect your ICS. There's nothing bad that can come from this. And dare I say as well, it will also help engineering. When they get visibility on packets, they also love security for that reason. Just below that is training for ICS security team members. Then we see that followed closely again by hiring specific folks for the ICS as well. It looks like not a lot of folks really want to encrypt the ICS, but there's some aspect you can utilize there, but there is a nuanced discussion that you can actually impact on several things. Reducing risk of transient devices as well shows up a bit there. And so that's what we have. Definitely visibility on the top of the 32%. Roland, what's your thoughts on seeing this result?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, this is what we've been talking about, I think, in terms of visibility, tools, training, and resources. So making sure that you're reducing the risk of those devices coming into your ICS facility, training team members, hiring folks to be able to provide those services to the business, I think is great.
Awesome. Dave, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, very much the same. When I look at this, I see people, process, and technology, right? And really, that's what we're hearing as well. We all know that we have a skill shortage and probably not enough people. Yeah. So we need to be focusing on training and hiring and bringing people into the ICS security discipline. But visibility does go a long way, and investments in visibility do pay off.
Excellent. I would agree 100% with both of you guys and your expertise here as well. And again, focusing on the visibility and hiring the team. You mentioned like there's a shortage. Totally get that. An opportunity for folks coming into ICS from IT, come over to the dark side. We need more folks in ICS security, but it's shadow those engineers, right? Bring them coffee and donuts, have conversations, get in the plant safely, operate and follow their guidance and learn from the engineering side. I think that's a really good place to kind of go. All right, so we're going to pivot to the closing statements for the session today. So we definitely want to thank everybody for joining. Again, my name is Dean Parsons, and for training, I do teach ICS 515 and 418 as well. Pass it back to Dave and Roland there for any closing statements before I pass it back to Carol. Guys, what's your thoughts?
I think this is very consistent with the themes, the questions, the polls, the answers, very consistent with what we see in the marketplace. And we have a lot of work to do, but I think the tool set is maturing and knowledge are maturing quickly, and that's very encouraging. And there's people willing to help, and I think we can make meaningful change and improvement by investing. Right. Excellent, Roland.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think this was both hopefully for the audience informative and entertaining. There's, to Dave's point, there's a lot of work to do. But I think the slides you put together were absolutely fantastic based on the conversations where, there's some roadmaps that are out there. And so there's tools, resources, and training that's available. So it's great. So yeah, again, thanks to everyone that put this together and that listened in.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks again for everybody for joining. And again, the last hurrah, totally ICS defense is doable. Like, pom-poms, like totally a cheerleader for this. This is doable. And for critical infrastructure, I think it's necessary. So thanks again, everybody. I'll pass it over to Carol, and definitely hoping to see everybody here at some point in the future in class and or at a conference. Drop me a note, connect, and let's have a further conversation on protecting critical infrastructure. Carol.
All right. Thank you so much, Dean, Dave, and Roland for your great presentation, and to Arrow Electronics and OTORIO for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.